Well, good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome all of you to today's presentation. This is Statutory and Regulatory Requirements, Anticipating Expectations Within a Quality Management System, or ISO 9001 Audit. My name is Joseph Krolikowski. I am the QMS Program Manager for PJR. Couple of notes for everyone today. All of our participants are on mute, but we absolutely want to address your questions. So we ask that you utilize the question portion of the dashboard. We will address your questions at the end of our presentation. One of the more common questions that we get is whether or not the presentation will be available after we are finished. We make our presentations available in two ways. If you'd like to get a copy of the slides will be available for download shortly after we're finished. And we will also be posting the recording of today's webinar on our YouTube page, and you can access that at www.pjr.com. Just look for the link entitled Previously Recorded Webinars. Now, our topics for today, we're going to address kind of in a general sense what statutory and regulatory requirements are all about. And we're also going to address why PJR is auditing statutory and regulatory requirements and what are we specifically looking at. We're going to explore where the ISO 9001 standard addresses statutory and regulatory requirements. We'll give a few examples of statutory and regulatory requirements that are most common in a quality management system. And then at the end, we'll have a few concluding remarks and your questions. Now, statutory and regulatory requirements are defined officially within the ISO 9000 document. That is, of course, the fundamentals and vocabulary document. Statutory is defined as an obligatory requirement specified by a legislative body. And regulatory is defined as an obligatory requirement, but this time specified by an authority mandated by a legislative body. Now, obviously, the main difference between statutory and regulatory requirements is where they are coming from. Statutory requirements are derived from the word statutes. These are legal requirements that come from laws passed by state or federal governments. Now, regulatory requirements, as the name would imply, these come from regulations. For example, EPA requirements, OSHA requirements, and so forth. These are agencies that have been empowered by the government to have the authority to then regulate an industry and establish policy. And typically these are going to be found in the Code of Federal Regulations, or CFR. So for example, the Food and Drug Administration has been given statutory authority to regulate food and drug safety, and that comes through the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Safety Act. However, the specifics of the labeling and practicing requirements are going to come from Title 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations, the regulations that are then issued by the FDA in order to help them fulfill their statutory authority to regulate. So to kind of boil this down, always think of statutes as the law, and most often those laws are going to be very general. The regulations are going to be rules that are developed to interpret the law and are going to much more often be more specific. So for example, the statute might say that excessive levels of certain pollutants cannot be permitted in or near major bodies of water. Again, using the Environmental Protection Agency as an example, they would then issue regulations that tell you, okay, what do we mean by an excessive level? What do we mean by a major body of water? And then those regulations would also go into what the enforcement plans are, getting to what Congress intended in passing that statute in the first place. So what does all this mean for ISO 9001, and why is PJR bothering with these kinds of requirements? Well, PJR, as I'm sure you are aware, is held accountable to a number of requirements as a certification body. Probably none more important than the ISO 17021 series of standards. The -1 of those standards has a clause within it that reads as follows. Auditing shall include the client's management system ability and its performance regarding the meeting of applicable statutory and regulatory requirements. So we are compelled to look at how your management system is meeting those requirements, and how you have positioned yourself to meet those requirements. Now, ISO 9001:2015 actually has a number of clauses that reference statutory and regulatory requirements. So let's go through this list. To begin with, in Section 5, there's a statement that the top management of an organization needs to ensure that statutory and regulatory requirements are determined, understood, and consistently met. So obviously that starts with the upper management of an organization. Now in Section 8.2, there's a couple of bookend requirements. First, under 8.2.2, it states that the organization has to include statutory and regulatory requirements among the things that they are determining during the contractual phase. So if you're quoting a job, if you are preparing a product catalog or something along those lines, the applicable statutory and regulatory requirements need to be considered. And then under 8.2.3, kind of the other end of this, statutory and regulatory requirements need to be reviewed prior to committing to supply a product or service to the customer. So, if there's going to be regulations on raw materials, if there's going to be regulations on packaging media, or things of that nature, the expectation is that you're going to take reasonable steps to make sure you are aware of those things before committing to supply the product or service to the customer. There are 3 other requirements, all found within Section 8. In Section 8.3.3, this is, of course, the design section. It indicates that statutory and regulatory requirements need to be among the design inputs. So in other words, if you are designing a product, you need to make sure that you are cognizant of any applicable statutory or regulatory requirements. Under Section 8.4, which is most commonly referred to as the purchasing section, it states that the organization needs to make sure that its external providers or suppliers do not adversely affect compliance to statutory and regulatory requirements. And then finally, in Section 8.5.5, you may think of this as the warranty section, the post-delivery section. It states that the organization needs to ensure that statutory and regulatory requirements are included in determining the extent of applicable post-delivery activities. So for example, if there is a product that you are selling that the local law states you must provide warranty on that particular product, well, that would obviously factor into your arrangements for post-delivery activities. So in terms of how we have approached this requirement from an auditing perspective, what we have done is we've placed 2 targeted questions in the audit report that pertain to statutory and regulatory requirements. And what these questions are intended to do is to prompt appropriate investigation and discourse with the auditee. We recognize that this is going to be of limited applicability in some circumstances, and it's going to be of very heightened applicability in others. And accordingly, with an audit report needing to be a one-size-fits-all situation, we had to make sure that our audit report was broad enough to approach that effectively. Now, in terms of some common statutory and regulatory requirements, probably most common of all are going to be the occupational health and safety requirements. Getting into things like personal protective equipment, ergonomics, safety training, and so forth. We see that in just about every manufacturing company that we do audits for. Those requirements are considered applicable. Companies that sell to the Department of Defense or the aerospace industries are most often going to fall under the ITAR, the International Traffic in Arms Regulation. This gets into things like controlled access to the facility, controlled access to records, and so forth. Safety data sheets, similar to the OSHA requirements. We see these very often as well, things that cover handling, use, disposal, etc. of chemical-based products. This could include product cleaning materials, could include product packaging, could touch on raw materials, and so forth. Now, it's important to understand that many of the things that we are reviewing in the audit process are already going to be helping us determine what's applicable. If you think about it, we're already reviewing contracts and purchase orders. We're already looking at blueprints and specifications. So the auditors are already in a position to kind of pick up on these things as a regular part of the audit process. So there should not be a special statutory regulatory requirement portion of the audit. That's not the intent. It's intended to be part of the flow of the audit, if you will. Now, one of the things that we have emphasized to our auditors is kind of drawing a line between what we can and what we cannot do. This is a confirmation that you have an effective process in place for identifying and complying with the relevant statutory and regulatory requirements. Again, I will remind you of how this is worded in the 17021 standard. We're supposed to look at your ability and performance regarding the meeting of the applicable requirements. So our job is to make sure that you have an effective process for identifying and implementing, not to audit the specific line items therein. So we're not OSHA auditors, we're not EPA auditors, and so forth. Our job is simply to make sure that you have an effective process in place. So as I mentioned a few slides ago, we have a two-part question within our audit report. This is the actual set of questions that have been prepared, and I've filled in with some sample data here. So the first question, is there an effective process for identification of applicable statutory and regulatory requirements? And hopefully that is yes when that's answered. And then, are there any current projects or products that you observed during the audit where it was necessary for you to sample overall implementation or understanding of the applicable statutory regulatory requirements? Provide a summary. So in this particular case, this is clearly an aerospace or Department of Defense supplier. So the auditor here has referenced ITAR as well as DFARS, the domestic sourcing requirements. And in both cases, the auditor has indicated that these requirements have been effectively implemented. Now, obviously, anytime we're talking about requirements in the context of an audit, there's going to be concerns as to whether or not we might be looking at a nonconformance. It is conceivable that an auditor might find a disconnect between an implemented process and an applicable statutory or regulatory requirement. But whether that meets the criteria for a nonconformance, we have to consider this with a bit of discretion. And we've emphasized this to our audit team as well. Is this going to impact customer satisfaction or the attainment of an objective? And does this impede your ability to manufacture the product or render the service? So we've emphasized that, as I said, to the audit team, and we've reminded them that if the nonconformance is in fact warranted, they have to ensure that the requirements cited include an appropriate clause from ISO 9001:2015. Again, we're not there to audit OSHA or EPA requirements or things of that nature. So in conclusion, PJR wants to ensure that we are providing our clients with a value-added audit and meeting all applicable requirements. We do hope that the points of our presentation today are going to help you develop a better understanding of what the expectations are within an audit for statutory and regulatory requirements. I'd like to invite you to tune in for one of our other webinars. One of the more popular webinars that we have is entitled The Interaction of Processes and Its Importance to a Successful Audit. This is an exploration of the concept of processes and how to understand that concept. We also have a presentation entitled Non-Applicable Clauses, Permissible Exclusions, and Exemptions. This is an exploration of what you can and cannot exclude within a quality management system. We've also got presentations on a variety of other topics, things like Stage 1 auditing, ISO 9001 itself, and a variety of other topics. If you'd like to be kept informed of the latest news automatically, the best way for you to do that is to opt in. And the way to do that is to go to our website at www.pjr.com. If you go to the bottom of the page, enter your email address and click subscribe, you'll be opted in for updates on new webinars and other points of information. I do thank you for your time. I'm going to go ahead and unlock the question portion of the dashboard. Amit Panwar asks, how do statutory and regulatory requirements apply for a software products company? It's an interesting question. I'm not an expert on the software industry. I would only say that certainly it strikes me as plausible that there would be applicable statutory and regulatory requirements for that industry, perhaps touching on things like what software can and cannot do, where it can and cannot be distributed, perhaps, things of that nature. But as the stewards of that organization, it would be your job to exercise appropriate rigor in determining those requirements. If you were to come back and say that there are none that are applicable, I don't think our auditors would necessarily challenge that, that conclusion. As long as you could show that you had exercised a process in arriving at that conclusion. Ayman Eshra asks, can I share an audit report according to ISO 9001? I think if you're referring to the example that we showed on what the statutory and regulatory requirements were, obviously I cannot share anything from a PJR client, but I'll reemphasize to you that the content of that report potentially is going to vary from case to case in terms of what the applicable statutory and regulatory requirements would be. Any other questions today? Okay, thank you all for your time. Hope everyone has a great day.